Hello, everybody. My name is Shawn, and I'm coming to you today from Tokyo, Japan, and it's my great pleasure to be part of your science festival. I wish I could be there in person, and maybe someday I will be. But for today, I hope this video that I send over is enough to arouse some curiosity and provide some new insights into how we think about what life is and how could life begin. So I want to discuss and pose some questions today about what life is and lead us into thinking about how life may have started. And before we do that, I want us to think about what this beautiful cherry tree is that I have taken a picture of a few weeks ago. It was the sakura cherry blossom season in Japan. And I took this beautiful picture of a tree outside of the institute where I work, called the Earth-Life Science Institute. And I want to use this cherry tree to start thinking about what life is. So what is it? Well, from a chemical perspective, we could think about what are the molecules of life. And looking at this cherry tree, we can see that these molecules have been arranged in a very beautiful pattern, a series of patterns. How are they organized? How are these molecules put together? What is the force of the organization behind these molecules? From early times, and I think all of us have an intuitive sense that life is somehow different from what we usually consider to be non-living. And one critical factor of what makes life different from what we might call non-life is its organization. So what are these molecules and how are they organized? What is the force of that organization? Well, if we look at this cherry tree and we zoom in and we think about what is this flower actually made out of? Well, it's made out of cells, and the cells themselves are made out of these different types of molecules that I list up here. RNA, DNA, these are the informational polymers of life. This is what we find, DNA being the component of the genome, RNA being a temporary information passaging molecule, which leads to the production of proteins. We know from our daily lives that we need to eat proteins ourselves as humans, so we may know that word, proteins. Sugars, many of us like sugars. I think we all know what those are like. They're sweet and taste good, full of energy, and same but similar different taste with fats, energy-rich molecules, less oxygen on fats than with sugars, but also delicious. And in addition to these major classes of molecules, RNA, DNA, proteins, sugars, and fats, there's a whole bunch of small molecules, including water. Water is one of the very important molecules of life. We use it in our cells as a fluid where other molecules, small molecules, and also big molecules, even really big molecules like whole genomes, which are made out of DNA, are able to move around the cell and communicate with other molecules. So water is a kind of a medium of communication in chemical sense for cells, and it also allows cells to move things inside and out of the cells. And another important component that is often not discussed is that of metals. We know from our nutritional requirements that we need to be eating foods with iron. When we bleed, we can see that our blood is red, and that's a direct consequence of the iron content in our blood. So we need to have metals in our diet. Metals play really critical components, critical function in the movement of molecules and also the movement of electrons throughout our cells. We often don't think of ourselves as being really reliant on metals, but we are. We just need a small amount, but they're very, very important for us. So that's what we might think about what life is, just from a compositional standpoint. But it's more than that, isn't it? There are many things around us that have RNA, DNA, proteins, sugars, fats, etc. inside of them, but they are not life. For example, if I make some chicken soup, the chicken soup has all of these types of molecules inside of it. But the chicken soup is not alive, and the chicken soup will not come back to life. It used to be part of a living system, a chicken, but by the time I make it into chicken soup, which as an aside, I won't because I'm a vegetarian, so I should be talking about some delicious vegetable soup. By the time I make that vegetable soup, the vegetables are dead. The molecules are still retained in them, but the critical organization of those molecules has been disrupted by the time I make soup out of them, for example. So again, I want us to think about today together, what is the possible organizational force for taking these molecules and putting them together to make things like this beautiful cherry tree or the beautiful vegetables that I make my soup out of. And to do that, I want us to consider, what does life do? Here we have a picture on this slide of what life is. Well, it's an arrangement of molecules, but it's more than that. It's an active, changing, organized, continuously organized arrangement of molecules. So what does it do? What does life do? I want to suggest that it continuously organizes itself, and I want to use a little bit of chemistry to help us rationalize how that organization is accomplished. How is this organization accomplished chemically? Well, in the case of a tree, we could write out a loose, not completely accurate, but helps us kind of picture chemically what a tree or a plant does. We could write out a loose equation like this one that I've written out here. Take light plus water plus carbon dioxide that we have in the atmosphere and a tree. We start with life, and we take these molecules and energy in the form of light. And what does the tree do? The tree makes more trees. It makes more of itself, makes things like these beautiful flowers, makes more branches, but it also makes seeds. And the seeds are what turns into more trees. So the tree makes more trees. And this is generally true of life. Life makes more life. So how can we break this down chemically? I want to suggest that we can break this down chemically in this way. We could think about a chemical reaction of life where there are energy components. Here I have highlighted light, water, and CO2 and oxygen as being major energy components of this chemical reaction. When the tree makes more trees, some force or some energy is needed to organize all of the molecules that will become the tree. And in the case of the tree, the force or the energy is in the form of light. And part of that force, or the ability to use that force, requires the release of oxygen. So together, both the left-hand side of this rough chemical equation and the right-hand side of the chemical equation can be considered as an energy component. And in the middle of that energy component, I've written down this material component. The CO2 is used both for energy and for material. The CO2 is used to derive the carbon that the tree is synthesized out of, to make more branches, to make more trees. Well, this isn't the complete picture. It's very, very rough. We don't, and I just want to mention that there are other elements that are required here: nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, hydrogen, and the metals, like I mentioned in the previous slide. But roughly, we can consider energy and material in our conception of life and what life is doing. It's organizing material or molecules using energy to do that. If we think about this more broadly, here's a picture of some small genomes here. This little orange squiggly line or set of lines is is meant to represent the DNA double helix, biological information. And the biological information, when a tree makes more trees, for example, one tree with, or one cell with one genome, for example, is copied, and 2 different genomes are made, and then 4, and so on and so on and so on. So this is how growth occurs from the genome level. But if we think back to the previous slide, considering energy and information, let's think about what the genome is. The genome is organized. It's an organized molecule. It's organized elements. The elements are pieced together in a very specific way. And the way that these elements are pieced together into molecules, and the position of all of these molecules together to make one large DNA molecule, holds the information that tells the tree how to copy itself to make a new tree. So it's a library of sorts. And what life does, or one kind of fun way to think about life, is that it's a library which copies itself, or it's a book that copies itself. And this is drawn as a biologist would draw it here with these squiggly lines that represent the DNA helix. But we can think about it very roughly, perhaps in an offhand way, using analogy, as a book that copies itself. Of course, if you want to copy a book, it requires energy. It takes some power. If you do it by hand, it takes a lot of energy. If you do it with your computer, you have to plug it in. So it takes energy to copy information. And that is one of the key questions, I think, for the origin of life and how do we understand life. What is the energy source here? How is energy used to power DNA replication? Well, when DNA is replicated, it's not a perfect copy. There's always a mistake. Isn't that true too? If one of us here tries to copy a book using our own handwriting, we all make mistakes. It's natural, it's normal. It may even be impossible to copy something perfectly without some loss of information. And this inability to copy information is actually what leads to the diversity of life on the planet. As genomes are copied, some mistakes are made. And over time, these mistakes, some of them are forgotten, some of them are replaced or fixed or repaired, but some of these mistakes stick around. They stay around. And these mistakes that stay around are the source of diversity on the planet. So here I've represented diversity just by using these different shapes. They might represent different shapes of cells, but over long periods of time, this diversification leads to the biological diversity that we can see around us today, including the differences that we see around each of us. If we're sitting in a room with each other, we're all different. We're all slightly different at the level of our genomes. And this same difference in DNA leads to differences between humans and chimpanzees. And it's also the basis of all of the differences between microbes, which I have drawn out here. There are even star-shaped microbes. So they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Why does it happen? Well, I love this quote by Daniel Dennett. Well, evolution is a process that depends on amplifying things that almost never happen. Some little mistake happens when genome is being copied. Sometimes the mistake is repaired. Sometimes it's kind of forgotten. And by forgotten, I mean it shifts back to its initial state. But sometimes it stays around. And that makes people like me who have blonde hair, and that makes other people have brown hair, etc., etc. Well, these things almost never happen, but they stick around. They're amplified. And they're amplified because life grows. A tree makes more trees. And if one cherry tree has pink flowers and a subsequent tree has white flowers by chance, by accident, well, those white flowers may be amplified. So this is the source of diversity on the planet. It's all accomplished by energy, and there are many types of energy that life uses. When I showed that beautiful cherry tree, we were talking about photosynthesis, the use of light to take CO2 from the atmosphere and to make more trees and to produce oxygen, which is very nice for us because we're all breathing oxygen right now. That's very nice that the trees make that for us. We're able to use that, and we're able to return oxygen back to CO2. There are other types of cells that don't use oxygen, like this type of cell here. Hydrogen plus CO2 plus a cell makes more cells plus methane plus water. Now I'm not writing out these equations to be stoichiometrically or chemically balanced. I'm just writing them out to give us an idea of which types of molecules can be combined together to gain energy from the environment and to make more cells. Here is another type of energy source. And in fact, this is the type of energy source that we use. We take sugars and fats, proteins, and other molecules, but in this, we could think about it as sugar. Take some sugar, our bodies combine the sugar with oxygen. This happens in one of our cells, it happens in our mitochondria, and we make more cells. We use energy from the combination of sugar and oxygen to make more cells, and we breathe out CO2. Where is the CO2 coming from? It's coming from molecules like sugars and fats that we have eaten. We also make some water in the process. And there are many, many other types of energy sources that we can find around us. We can think about the types of energy in the same way that we used to think about photosynthesis earlier on in the discussion. For photosynthesis, I mentioned that we could think about light and water and CO2 and oxygen as the energy component of this type of a reaction. And for this hydrogen plus CO2 and also the sugar plus O2 type of chemical reaction, we could do a similar thing and think of that these blue underlined portions are really contributing to the energetics of the reaction, and these purple components are really the material side of things. Remember, earlier on I said that life is really organized chemistry. So here's the organized chemistry. I'm using the word cell, but to be very, very general, I might use the word organized chemistry. Organized chemistry uses some energy in one of these different forms. One of the surprising or very interesting things to me about all of the energy sources that I know of that life can use to organize chemistry is that all of these, when we study them closely, when we look at these reactions closely, they're all electron transfer reactions. Let's think about what I mean by that. For example, hydrogen, in this reaction, it donates electrons to CO2. And it takes 4 hydrogens to reduce CO2 all the way to methane. Make some water. Again, these are not balanced equations. They're just meant to give us a general idea of the process without getting us into too much technical detail. Here's another reaction here. Sugars have electrons on them. Those electrons can flow onto O2. CO2 is released, and so is water. This reaction here is actually a combustion reaction. So if you are a little bit cold and you're sitting by a nice wood fire, wood is made out of or composed of a lot of different materials, DNA, RNA, proteins, sugars, fats, etc. But when we burn wood, we're taking all of those materials, which we might approximate grossly, very approximate, we might approximate that as sugars. Electrons that are stored on those carbon molecules in the wood, those electrons flow onto oxygen. And the movement of the electrons onto oxygen, which produces water and CO2, releases a huge amount of energy. You can light a fire. It's warm, it feels great. It makes light, it makes noise, it makes heat. All of this energy is released when electrons move. So we know that just from having fires around us. This is Same type of reaction that's used in our body, but it's happening at an atomic scale. The electrons are not moving so fast to start a fire. Instead, the electrons are being used to organize chemistry. Well, I'm not telling us about everything if I just use light and CO2 like plants, or hydrogen in CO2, or sugar in CO2. There are other types of reactions, and in microbiology we call them fermentations. In this case, the molecule that we would write on the left, which we would call a substrate molecule, it accepts some of the electrons. I think my picture here is cutting off the slide here, but there's no big secret behind me. This just says electrons over here. So in fermentation, we can write out a molecule like this. One glucose molecule with 6 carbons goes to 2 CO2s and 2 ethanols. So this reaction is a little bit different from the type above because it's not as straightforward to write energy and material. But I could write cells on this side, and I could write more cells on the right side. This would be the type of energy source. And this one, electronically, it's a little bit more different. It's a little different from these ones above. It's not that electrons from sugar go onto O2, for example, or electrons from hydrogen go onto CO2, for example. Instead, in this case, the electrons are split. They're separated from the glucose. So it's like just causing a small chemical explosion by glucose itself. The electrons are split. And that splitting is energetically favorable, and the cells use that energy to organize themselves. Now I know that you are in Greece, and you have around you very delicious wine. So this is the type of chemical reaction that's happening during the formation of the wine. It's happening by yeast. They're using glucose to make ethanol and to make more cells. I know you're there in Greece with your very delicious wine, and well, I'm happy to tell you that I'm over here in Japan with very delicious sake. It's too early in the morning for me to have this today, but I may think about having some later on this evening. It's the same thing that happens in this bottle of sake. In this case, it's not a yeast of the type that we would find in one of your delicious Greek wines, but it's the same chemical reaction. Glucose from the rice, or sugars from the rice, plus cells, goes to CO2 and ethanol. Fermentation. So the point, or the message I want to get across is that it's really the movement of electrons that power cells. To say this more broadly, life is self-replicating chemistry, and it's energized by electron flow. So all of these molecules, RNA, DNA, proteins, blah, 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 all of these molecules are organized by electron flow. Here's some lightning bolts that I playfully put on top of the cherry tree. It's not a big lightning bolt that's going on in a cherry tree to organize the chemistry, but it is very small scale electron transfer reactions that lead to the organization of the molecules in the cherry tree. Very broadly, we can think in that way, and to understand the origin of life, I suggest that we think about what could the spark of life have been. And it may have really actually have been a spark. All life that we know today requires electron transfer reactions. So one of the big questions that we have to understand the origin of life is, what is the original source of electrons to organize material? Energy is released. Life requires energy to copy itself, to build more of itself. What could that spark have been? Well, to try to understand what that spark may have been, we could think of what was the early Earth like. And maybe it looks like this. Here's a picture from NASA. Lots of volcanoes and impacts coming down from space. And well, the days are very short, and the tides, if there's any land at all, the tides are very, very high. And so what is the spark, and how can this spark be used to organize material? going back to our list of chemical reactions that we wrote out, we know that the early Earth had very low oxygen. So immediately we can see that the early Earth did not have trees on it. Perhaps the early Earth had types of life that were doing this type of a chemistry. This reaction doesn't involve any oxygen in it. So maybe this reaction is one reaction that could have been on the early Earth. Organisms like ourselves that use sugar and oxygen, probably not on the early Earth. Very low oxygen, and there probably was not a good supply of sugar on the early Earth. That also means there's not going to be any 4 billion year old wine or 4 billion year old Japanese sake that's going to be ever discovered. Instead, we can think about cells or types of chemical reactions that lead to the origin of life that look like this reaction here. Where could that have happened? One place this may have happened is at hydrothermal vents under the ocean. These are fascinating organized structures themselves that are made out of minerals, but inside of them, they have electrons in the form of hydrogen gas and hydrogen sulfide. And it may have been that hydrogen gas and hydrogen sulfide were some of the very first electron donors, the givers of electrons that created the spark of life. And that might look something like this in this cartoon diagram that I have here. Molecules like hydrogen and hydrogen sulfide may have sent electrons to the outside through a mineral barrier. Here it's labeled an iron sulfide chimney. Those electrons may have been able to combine with molecules like carbon dioxide, maybe nitrate, or iron. And the big question is, could this movement of electrons be used to power something like information copying? Well, I don't know. But I hope it's true. I hope it's possible. I think it may be possible. It's a big challenge for us in the origin of life. I and other researchers are now using similar reaction schemes as the one that I showed you in a cartoon format. We're designing small reactors in the laboratory that act like a hydrothermal vent may have acted, where electrons from the left-hand side of this laboratory simulation of a hydrothermal vent can move to the right-hand side, and work can be done in the form of the reduction of carbon dioxide reduction. We're making very, very small steps towards our understanding of how electron transfer could be linked to information, but it's a big goal for us. And that's what we're trying to do at this institute where I work. We're trying to understand how electron flow may have organized chemistry from the very first, and eventually, of course, that chemistry became what we know today as life. Life is self-replicating chemistry, and it's organized and energized by electron flow. So when we look at life, let's think about it in terms of electron flow. Where are the electrons from, and where are they going? What is the origin of life, and what is the central question for the origin of life? My suggestion is that we can think about this question in a different way. We can think about it much more broadly. We can ask this question: how does the movement of electrons organize material? Life is one example of how electrons can organize material. Electrons could organize material in other ways. And indeed, even looking at life, there are many types of life where electrons have organized material in many other ways too. That's all for me today. I hope the discussion has been interesting, and I hope it gives us a new way to think about life, what life is, and gives us some ideas about how life may have started. And I just want to say, here we are in Japan, in Tokyo here, where my little laser pointer is. When you come to Japan, unfortunately Japan doesn't allow visitors at the moment, but someday soon, we hope. And when you come to Japan, please feel free to look us up at the Institute, where we're trying to understand the origin and evolution of life as accomplished by electron flow. I hope everybody has a really wonderful conference, and I want to thank the conference organizers for inviting me to participate. It's my great pleasure. Cheers from here. Thanks a lot.